I still remember the exact temperature that night, -8 degrees Celsius. I know because I checked the thermometer on our back porch 3 times before going to bed, worried about the pipes freezing. The wind was coming from the northeast at about 15 kilometers per hour, and I could hear it whistling through the gaps in our old wooden house. We'd lived in that 2-story place since 1920, and every winter it reminded us just how drafty those old frames could get. December 24th, 1945. Christmas Eve. Jenny had spent the entire day cooking. The smell of her Italian bread still hung in the air when I finally settled into bed around 11:30. Our 10 children were scattered throughout the house, the older ones helping wrap last-minute presents downstairs while the younger 5 had already been tucked into their beds on the second floor. Maurice was 14 then, Martha 12, Louis 9, little Jenny 8, and Betty had just turned 5 the month before. I was just drifting off when I heard Jenny stirring beside me. The phone was ringing harsh and metallic in the quiet house. I glanced at the wind-up clock on our nightstand. 12:30 in the morning. Who calls at that hour on Christmas Eve? Jenny padded barefoot to the hallway phone, and I could hear her voice, puzzled and tired. Hello? Hello? There was a pause, then she spoke again, more confused now. I'm sorry, there's no one here by that name. I heard her hang up, but the phone rang again immediately. This time when she answered, I heard something that made my skin crawl, laughter. Not the warm kind you hear at family gatherings, but something sharp and mocking. Then the line went dead. She came back to bed shaking her head. Someone asking for a person I never heard of, she whispered. Then just laughing. I told her it was probably kids playing pranks, but something about her expression bothered me. Jenny had good instincts about people, always had. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, something was wrong with the air itself. It was 1:15 in the morning. I remember because I looked at that clock again, confused about why I'd woken up. The air tasted metallic, and there was this smell that didn't belong. Not with smoke from our fireplace, but something chemical and sharp. Then I heard Jenny scream my name. I bolted upright and saw the orange glow bleeding under our bedroom door. The hallway was already thick with smoke, and when I touched the door handle, the metal was hot enough to burn my palm. The stairs, our only way to the children on the second floor, were completely engulfed. I could hear them calling for us, their voices high and frightened, but the heat was so intense I couldn't get within 10 feet of the staircase. My mind went to the ladder we kept outside for roof repairs. I ran out in my underwear, the December air hitting my skin like knives, but when I got to where we always stored it, there was nothing there. Just empty space where that ladder should have been. I sprinted to our old coal truck, thinking I could drive it close to the house, climb onto the cab, maybe reach the second-floor windows that way. The engine wouldn't turn over. I tried again, pumping the gas, checking everything I could think of in the dark. Nothing. I ran back inside to call the fire department, but when I picked up our phone, there was no dial tone. The line was completely dead. That's when I heard something that still wakes me up at night, 74 years later. The crying from upstairs just stopped. All at once. Like someone had thrown a switch. 5 children who had been calling for their mama and daddy, and then silence. I stood there in our living room, flames eating through the ceiling above me, and I knew with absolute certainty that something was wrong beyond just a house fire. Fires don't consume everything that fast. Wood burns, sure, but it takes time. Our house was completely gutted in exactly 43 minutes. I timed it by the kitchen clock that somehow kept running until the very end. But here's what haunts me most: when the fire department finally showed up 7 hours later, when we dug through what was left of our home, we found metal objects from the second floor. Jenny's sewing machine, the boys' toy soldiers, even small nails and screws. But 5 children? Not a trace. Not a bone fragment, not a tooth, nothing. The fire chief told us the heat had been so intense it incinerated their bodies completely. But I knew something about fire from working the coal mines. Human bones don't just disappear. Even in crematoriums running at 1400 degrees for hours, there are always remains. Our house fire burned at maybe half that temperature for less than an hour. The fire department arrived at 8 in the morning. 8 o'clock. 7 hours after I first smelled that chemical smoke. Chief Bowyer climbed out of the truck like he was going to a Sunday picnic, not rushing to what should have been the worst tragedy our little town had ever seen. I remember thinking that was strange. Why wasn't he moving faster? Why did he keep checking his pocket watch? When they finally started examining what was left of our house, I stood right next to Bowyer with a thermometer I'd grabbed from our neighbor's tool shed. The core temperature where our living room used to be was still 340 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to melt lead. But Bowyer spent exactly 45 minutes poking around in the debris with a shovel, never digging deeper than maybe 2 feet. Complete consumption, he announced, wiping soot off his hands. Bodies were incinerated due to the intensity of the fire. I stared at him. Chief, our coal furnace in the basement ran at 800 degrees, and I can still see metal pieces from it scattered around. How do 5 children just disappear? He wouldn't look me in the eye. Just kept writing in his little notebook, same 3 words over and over. Complete consumption. Complete consumption. That's when I started asking questions that apparently nobody wanted answered. I walked over to where our phone line connected to the house and found something that made my blood run cold. The wire had been cut clean through, not burned, not damaged by fire, cut with wire snippers about 3 feet up the pole. Someone had deliberately severed our connection before the fire started. Our truck told an even uglier story. My neighbor Frank, who'd been fixing engines since before the war, spent 2 hours going through what was left of the motor. "George," he said, and his voice was shaking, "somebody poured sand in your oil pan and pulled your brake lines loose. This wasn't no accident." I found our ladder 75 meters away from the house, hidden behind the Johnsons' wooden fence. It wasn't thrown there by any explosion or fire. Someone had carried it there and deliberately concealed it. The more I dug, the sicker I felt. Mrs. Patterson, who lived just across the hollow, told me she'd seen a black sedan parked on the dirt road behind our property around 11:45 Christmas Eve. "Thought it was strange," she said, "because the engine was running but nobody got out. Just sat there with the headlights off for maybe 20 minutes. I kept asking Bowyer about the investigation, about bringing in experts to examine the debris properly, about why nobody seemed concerned that 5 children had vanished without leaving so much as a tooth behind. He got irritated with me real fast. "Mr. Sodder, I understand you're grieving, but questioning my professional judgment isn't going to bring your children back." Professional judgment. That's what he called 45 minutes with a shovel. I started researching cremation on my own, driving to Charleston to talk to funeral directors who actually knew about fire and human remains. What they told me changed everything. To completely incinerate human bones, not just burn them, but reduce them to nothing, requires sustained temperatures of at least 1400 degrees Celsius for 2 to 3 hours minimum. Even then, there are always fragments. Boys. Our house fire had burned at roughly half that temperature for less than an hour total. But the detail that really kept me awake was something I discovered 2 days after Christmas. I was walking through the debris again, unable to accept what I was being told, when I noticed something glinting near where our kitchen table used to be. I dug it out with my bare hands, not caring about the ash and soot under my fingernails. It was a small piece of vertebrae. Human vertebrae. But when I held it up to the light, I could see it was way too big to belong to any of my children. This was from an adult, and it had saw marks on it. Clean, deliberate cuts like someone had taken it apart with tools. I ran straight to the sheriff's office with that bone fragment, my hands still black with soot. Sheriff Morris looked at it for maybe 10 seconds before setting it down on his desk like it was contaminated. "Could be from anywhere, George. Could have washed down from the old cemetery during the spring floods." The nearest cemetery was 8 miles away, uphill from our property. I took that bone to Dr. Henderson in Beckley for a proper examination. He spent 3 hours studying it under magnification, taking measurements, comparing it to medical texts. "This is definitely human," he confirmed. "Adult male, probably middle-aged. And these marks." He traced the saw cuts with his finger. "These were made post-mortem. Someone dismembered this body with surgical precision." When I went back to retrieve the bone fragment 3 days later, Dr. Henderson looked embarrassed and wouldn't meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, George. The sample was accidentally destroyed during cleaning. Some kind of mix-up with the laboratory disposal." That bone was the only physical evidence we had that something more than a house fire had happened on our property. And it had conveniently disappeared. But 2 weeks later, something arrived in our mail that made me realize this nightmare was just beginning. The photograph came in a plain white envelope with no return address. Just our names written in block letters that looked like someone was trying to disguise their handwriting. When I opened it, my hand started shaking so badly that Jenny had to take it from me. It was Martha. Our 12-year-old Martha, but she looked older, maybe 15 or 16. She was wearing a school uniform I'd never seen before, standing in front of a brick building that definitely wasn't anywhere in West Virginia. But it was her. Same dark eyes, same small scar above her left eyebrow from when she'd fallen off her bicycle 2 summers before the fire. There was no note, no explanation. Just that photograph of my supposedly dead daughter looking directly into the camera, very much alive. I hired Morris, not Sheriff Morris, but a private investigator named Charlie Morris who'd worked for the federal government before the war. He was expensive, but he was the only man I could find who'd actually listen to what I was telling him instead of patting my shoulder and suggesting I move on with my grief. Morris spent 3 weeks examining our property with equipment I'd never seen before, some kind of chemical testing kit he'd brought from Charleston. What he found made me sick to my stomach. "George, this fire started in 3 separate locations simultaneously," he said, showing me scorch patterns in the debris. "Here by the front door, here near the kitchen, and here at the base of the stairs. House fires don't do that naturally. Someone used an accelerant, probably gasoline or kerosene, and they knew exactly where to place it for maximum damage." He found traces of the accelerant still soaked into the wooden beams that had survived. Some kind of petroleum-based fluid that wasn't anything we'd had stored in our house. Morris scraped samples into little glass bottles and labeled them with the date and location. But it was the timeline that really bothered him. "Your neighbor Mrs. Patterson saw that sedan at 11:45. The phone call to your wife came at 12:30. Fire started around 1:15. That's a 90-minute window where someone was preparing for this." I told him about the intimidation we'd received before the fire, things I hadn't wanted to worry Jenny about at the time. Back in October, a man had come to our house while I was at work. Medium height, wearing a suit that was too expensive for our neighborhood. He'd told Jenny he was conducting a survey about immigrant families and asked detailed questions about our daily routines, what time the children went to bed, whether we kept a telephone upstairs. When I got home that evening, Jenny was upset. "George, he knew things about us. He knew you worked at the mine, knew the children's names, knew we attended St. Francis Catholic Church. But when I asked who he was working for, he just smiled and said some people were concerned about families who didn't appreciate American values." I'd had run-ins with locals who didn't like my opinions about Mussolini and what was happening in Italy. I'd been vocal about supporting the Allied cause, and that had made some people uncomfortable. But this felt different. More organized. In November, we'd received 2 letters with no signatures. The first one had a photograph of our house taken from the woods behind our property, with red X marks drawn over the children's bedroom windows. The second letter was just a list of times. 7:30 a.m. children leave for school, 4:15 p.m. children return home, 8 p.m. children go to bed, 11:30 p.m. parents sleep. Someone had been watching us for weeks. Morris interviewed everyone in a 5-mile radius, and that's when we found Tommy Riggs. Tommy drove the school bus route that went past our hollow, and he'd seen something that haunted him. "Mr. Sodder, I was coming back from my Christmas Eve run around 2:30 in the morning, had to pick up my cousin from his shift at the mine. I saw a black car going real slow down Hollow Road, maybe 15 miles per hour. Through my headlights, I could see there were people in the back seat. Looked like children, but they were hunched over like they were scared or maybe tied up." Tommy's hands were shaking when he told us this. The car had government plates. You know, those special ones that don't have county markings. And the driver, when he saw my bus headlights, he sped up real fast and turned off onto the old logging road. Morris traced that logging road. It connected to 3 different state highways and could get you to Kentucky, Ohio, or Pennsylvania without going through any major towns where someone might remember seeing you. The more we learned, the clearer it became that someone had planned this operation with military precision. They'd studied our family, mapped our routines, disabled our truck and phone service, positioned the fire to block our access to the children, and had an escape route prepared. But the question that kept me awake at night was why? Why go through all this trouble to make it look like my children had died in a house fire when they could have just taken them? Why the elaborate deception? Morris had a theory that made my blood run cold. George, whoever did this, wanted those children to disappear completely from any official record. If they just kidnapped them, there would be an ongoing investigation, search parties, federal involvement. But if everyone believes they're dead, burned up in a house fire, then nobody looks for them. He paused, studying the photograph of Martha that had been mailed to us. Someone wanted your children alive, but they wanted the world to think they were dead. That suggests a very specific purpose, something that required healthy, intelligent children who could never be connected back to their original identities. 3 days after Morris shared his theory with me, his car was found burned out on a back road near Beckley. Morris was never seen again. Finding Morris's burned car changed everything. I knew then that we weren't just dealing with local criminals or even organized kidnappers. This was something bigger, something with enough power to make a federal investigator disappear without anyone asking questions. The sheriff's department spent exactly 2 hours at the scene. They ruled it an accidental crash and fire, despite the fact that Morris's car had skid marks leading straight off the road into a tree, like someone had forced him off the pavement. When I asked to see their report, Sheriff Morris, no relation to Charlie Morris, told me the file had been transferred to state jurisdiction, and I'd have to contact Charleston for information. Charleston told me no such file existed. That night I got a phone call that made my skin crawl. Male voice, calm and educated, with a slight accent I couldn't place. Mr. Sodder, you've lost 1 investigator already. How many more people need to have accidents before you accept that your children died in that fire? I gripped the phone so hard my knuckles went white. Who is this? What do you want? We want you to stop asking questions. We want you to stop hiring people to dig into matters that don't concern you. Most importantly, we want you to stop showing that photograph to people around town. The line went dead. Jenny and I barely slept that week. Every car that drove past our temporary rental house, every unexpected noise, every phone call made us jump. But I couldn't stop thinking about that photograph of Martha. Someone had taken the time to mail it to us, which meant they wanted us to know she was alive. But I decided to take a different approach. Instead of hiring outside investigators, I started quietly talking to people who had been involved in the original fire response. What I discovered made me realize just how deep this conspiracy went. Chief Bowyer had purchased a new house 2 weeks after our fire. Cash payment, according to the courthouse records I checked. His previous salary was $38 a week, but he'd somehow come up with $800 for a down payment. When I asked him about it, he claimed his wife had inherited money from a relative in Ohio. The telephone operator who'd been on duty Christmas Eve night, the one who supposedly couldn't connect my emergency call to the fire department, had been promoted to a supervisory position in Charleston just 3 days after our fire. Her replacement told me the previous operator had left suddenly, with no forwarding address. But the most disturbing discovery came when I examined the official death certificates for my 5 children. They'd been issued without any bodies, without any autopsies, without any actual proof that my children had died. All 5 were signed by the same medical examiner, Dr. Franklin Reeves. I'd never heard of Dr. Reeves, so I asked around. Turns out he'd lost his medical license in Pennsylvania 2 years earlier for falsifying death certificates in insurance fraud cases. Somehow he'd gotten licensed in West Virginia and was working as a part-time medical examiner for the county. When I confronted him at his office, Dr. Reeves got nervous immediately. He kept glancing toward his filing cabinet like he was worried I might try to look through his records. Mr. Sodder, I signed those certificates based on the fire chief's assessment of the scene. In cases of extreme fire damage, it's standard procedure to assume complete incineration when no remains are recovered. But you never examined any remains because there weren't any to examine. He started shuffling papers on his desk, avoiding eye contact. The fire chief assured me that the temperature and duration of the fire would have resulted in complete destruction of any human remains. Did Chief Bowyer pay you to sign those certificates, Dr. Reeves? That's when he stood up and told me to leave his office immediately or he'd call the sheriff. I was walking back to my car when a woman approached me in the parking lot. She was maybe 60 years old, well-dressed, and she looked terrified. "Are you George Sodder?" she whispered, glancing around like she was afraid someone might be watching. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Ruth Henderson. I work as a secretary for Dr. Reeves." She handed me a small piece of paper. "There's something you need to know about those death certificates." I unfolded the paper. Written in careful handwriting were 5 names, my children's names, with dates and amounts of money next to each one. $50 per certificate. Dr. Reeves was paid $250 to sign those death certificates, she whispered. Cash payment, made the same day your house burned down. The man who brought the money said it was for administrative efficiency, so your family could start the grieving process without delays. Who paid him? Did you see who brought the money? Medium height, expensive suit, government plates on his car. Same man who'd been asking questions around town about your family for weeks before the fire. She looked around nervously again. "Mr. Sodder, I've been Dr. Reeves's secretary for 12 years, and I've never seen anything like this. That man knew those children were going to die before your house ever caught fire." She hurried away before I could ask any more questions. That evening, I received a second photograph in the mail. This one showed 2 of my daughters, Betty and little Jenny, standing together in what looked like a farmyard. They were wearing clothes I'd never seen before, and they looked healthy but different somehow. Older but also sadder. Like something behind their eyes had changed. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in pencil, "They are well cared for. Stop looking or they won't be." The second photograph hit me harder than the first because I could see what they'd done to my little girls. Betty's face had always been round and bright, full of mischief. In this picture, she looked hollow around the eyes, like she'd seen things no 5-year-old should ever see. And little Jenny, who'd been named after her mama and had the same stubborn chin, was standing with her shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself invisible. But it was the background that really caught my attention. Behind the girls, I could see part of a barn with distinctive white trim and a red metal roof. More importantly, there was a man in work clothes standing near a fence post, just visible at the edge of the frame. He was watching my daughters like he was guarding them. I took that photograph to every farming community within a 100-mile radius, asking if anyone recognized the barn or the layout of that farmyard. Most people just shook their heads and looked at me with pity, thinking I was a grieving father who'd lost touch with reality. But in a small town called Cedar Creek, about 60 miles east of us, an old farmer named Walt Jameson studied that picture for a long time. "Mister, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but that barn belongs to the Hutchinson place. Been abandoned for maybe 2 years now, ever since old man Hutchinson died and his family moved to California." He handed the photograph back to me with a troubled expression. "But I drove past there last week, and there were lights on in that barn at night. Thought maybe someone was squatting on the property." I drove to the Hutchinson place that same afternoon. The farmhouse was boarded up, but the barn looked like it had been used recently. Fresh tire tracks in the mud, and when I pressed my ear to the wooden door, I could hear what sounded like machinery running inside. I was about to try to get a better look when a black sedan came up the dirt road fast, kicking up a cloud of dust. 2 men got out, both wearing suits that were too formal for farm country. One of them was the same man Ruth Henderson had described, the one who'd paid Dr. Reeves for those death certificates. "Mr. Sodder, you're trespassing on private property. This is abandoned land. I'm just looking around." "No, sir, this property has been purchased by a private organization for agricultural research. You need to leave immediately." The way he said, "agricultural research," made my stomach turn. These men weren't farmers, and they sure weren't researchers. They moved like military person, alert, coordinated, ready for trouble. "Have you seen 2 little girls around here? My daughters were taken from our house fire, and I have reason to believe they might have been brought to this area." The second man, who hadn't spoken yet, stepped closer to me. "Mr. Sodder, your daughters died in that fire. The death certificates are on file with the county. Continuing to spread stories about them being alive is disturbing the peace and causing problems for law-abiding citizens. I have photographs proving they're alive. You have photographs that could be anyone. Grief can make a man see things that aren't there. They escorted me back to my car and followed me for 15 miles to make sure I left the area. But as we were driving away, I looked in my rearview mirror and saw something that confirmed my worst fears. 3 children came out of that barn, 2 girls and a boy, all about the right ages. They were too far away for me to identify them clearly, but one of the girls had Betty's distinctive way of walking, slightly pigeon-toed from a childhood injury. That night, I called the state police and reported what I'd seen. The officer who took my statement was polite but skeptical. "Mr. Sodder, we'll send someone to check on that property, but I have to tell you, we've received complaints about you harassing local residents with stories about your deceased children. If this continues, we might have to consider it a public disturbance issue." 2 days later, I got a call from the same officer. "Mr. Sodder, we investigated that farm you mentioned. Property belongs to a legitimate agricultural research company called Mountain State Rural Development. They're conducting studies on sustainable farming practices. No children on the premises, no evidence of any illegal activity." "What about the barn? Did you search inside the barn?" The company representative showed us through the entire facility. "It's just farming equipment and research materials. I'm afraid you were mistaken about what you saw." But I knew what I'd seen. And more importantly, I knew someone had cleaned up that barn between my visit and the police investigation. The tire tracks had been smoothed over, the machinery sounds were gone, and there was fresh paint on parts of the building that had looked weathered when I was there. I started keeping a log of every strange occurrence, every person who seemed to be watching us, every official who gave me the runaround when I asked for help. The pattern that emerged terrified me. This wasn't just a kidnapping that someone was covering up. This was an organized operation involving local law enforcement, state officials, and people with enough authority to make evidence disappear. Jenny found my log one evening and read through the entire thing. When she finished, she was crying. "George, what if we're never going to see them again? What if whoever took them is so powerful that we'll never be able to get them back?" I held her while she sobbed, but I couldn't answer her question because I was starting to think she might be right. Every time I got close to finding something, the evidence vanished. Every person who tried to help me ended up having accidents or suddenly leaving town. Even the photographs stopped coming. But 3 months later, I received something in the mail that changed everything again. Not a photograph this time, but a letter written in a child's handwriting on school notebook paper. "Dear Daddy," it said, "we are okay but we can't come home. They told us you don't want us anymore because we were bad children. Please come find us. We are at a place with lots of other children but we don't like it here. They make us work all day and we don't get enough food. Love, Martha." At the bottom of the page, there was an address, Sunnyside Children's Home, Fairmont, Pennsylvania. I drove to Fairmont, Pennsylvania that same week, my hands shaking on the steering wheel the entire 4-hour trip. Jenny wanted to come with me, but I was afraid of what we might find, or what might happen to us if this was some kind of trap. The letter felt real, written in Martha's careful script that I'd helped her practice for homework assignments, but I'd learned not to trust anything anymore. Sunnyside Children's Home sat on a hill outside Fairmont, surrounded by a high fence that looked more like a prison than a place for orphan children. The building itself was 3 stories of gray brick with small windows, and when I pulled up to the gate, a security guard came out of a small booth to ask my business. "I'm looking for my daughter, Martha Sodder. I believe she might be here." The guard checked a clipboard, then went back into his booth to make a phone call. After about 5 minutes, he came back out with a different expression on his face, more cautious, like he'd been given specific instructions about how to handle me. "Sir, you'll need to speak with the director. Please park your car and wait in the front office." The inside of that place made my skin crawl. Everything was too clean, too quiet. Children's voices should echo through the halls of an orphanage, but I could barely hear anything. The few kids I saw moved through the corridors like they were afraid to make noise, keeping their eyes down when adults walked past. Director Sarah Whitman was a thin woman in her 50s who spoke in measured, careful sentences like she'd rehearsed our conversation before I arrived. She listened to my story without interrupting, occasionally taking notes in a leather-bound journal. "Mr. Sodder, I understand your grief, but I'm afraid there's been some mistake. We have no child here by the name of Martha Sodder. All of our residents are properly documented with the state authorities." I received a letter from her with this address, written in her handwriting. Sometimes people use our address fraudulently, hoping to scam money from grieving families. It's unfortunately more common than you might think. I pulled out the school photograph of Martha that we kept, the one taken just 2 months before the fire. "This is my daughter. Have you seen this child?" Director Whitman studied the photograph for longer than seemed necessary, and I saw something flicker across her face, recognition, maybe, or concern. "I'm sorry, but I don't recognize this child. However, if it would put your mind at ease, I can arrange for you to tour our facility." The tour was obviously planned to show me only certain areas. We walked through a dining hall where maybe 30 children sat eating lunch in complete silence, through classrooms where kids worked at wooden desks without talking to each other, and past dormitories with neat rows of narrow beds. Everything felt wrong, too controlled, too regimented for a normal children's home. But in one of the dormitories, I saw something that made my heart stop. On a bed in the far corner was a small cloth doll with yellow yarn hair and a blue dress. I'd made that doll for Martha's 8th birthday, staying up late in our workshop to get the stitching just right. She'd named it Caroline and taken it everywhere with her. "That doll," I said, pointing across the room. "Where did it come from?" Director Whitman followed my gaze and her face went pale. "Many of our children arrive with personal belongings. We allow them to keep small items for comfort. I made that doll with my own hands. That's my daughter's doll." "Mr. Sodder, many dolls look similar. I think your grief may be causing you to see connections that aren't really there." She ended the tour immediately after that, walking me quickly back to the front office and explaining that she had important meetings to attend. But as we passed the main staircase, I heard something that made me grab the banister to steady myself. A child's voice from upstairs, singing softly. It was a song I'd taught Martha when she was little, an old Italian lullaby my mother used to sing to me. The melody was unmistakable, and I'd never heard anyone else sing it quite the same way Martha did, with a little trill on the high notes. "I need to go upstairs," I said, starting toward the staircase. Director Whitman moved to block my path. "I'm afraid the upper floors are restricted. We have children up there who are recovering from trauma, and strangers can be very upsetting to them." The singing stopped abruptly, like someone had been warned we were coming. I left that place knowing my daughter was somewhere inside those walls, but also knowing that I had no legal way to get to her. These people had lawyers, official documents, and the backing of state authorities. I was just a coal miner who'd lost his children in a house fire, at least according to the official records. But I wasn't giving up. I spent the next 6 months filing legal papers, demanding investigations, writing letters to state representatives. I hired another lawyer, the third one since the fire, and we submitted formal requests for the children's home to provide documentation about all their residents. Everything was denied. Privacy laws, they said. Protecting the children from exploitation. Standard procedures that couldn't be waived even for biological parents. Then, just as my lawyer was preparing to file a federal lawsuit, I received a phone call that changed everything again. "Mr. Sodder, this is Director Whitman from Sunnyside Children's Home. I'm calling to inform you that we've completed a thorough review of our records in response to your inquiries." My heart started pounding. "Did you find Martha?" "We did locate 2 children who match some of the physical descriptions you provided. However, I'm afraid they were transferred to adoptive families in Canada last week. The adoption process is confidential, and we cannot provide any information about the families or their locations." The timing was impossible. They'd held those children for months while I fought through legal channels, then moved them just days before my lawsuit would have forced them to allow me access. "You're lying," I said. "You've been moving my children around to stay ahead of my investigations." "Mr. Sodder, I understand your frustration, but these accusations are becoming harassment. If you contact this facility again, we'll be forced to involve law enforcement." She hung up before I could respond. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a bottle of whiskey and tried to figure out how many people would have to be involved in a conspiracy this large. Local police, state officials, medical examiners, children's home directors, adoption agencies, maybe even federal authorities. The scope of it was overwhelming. But the next morning, something happened that gave me hope again. A woman came to our door, young, maybe 25, with nervous eyes and clothes that suggested she'd traveled a long distance. "Are you George Sodder? I think I have information about your children." Her name was Carol McKinnon, and she was shaking when I invited her into our kitchen. She kept glancing out the windows like she expected someone to be watching the house, and she wouldn't sit down until I closed all the curtains. "Mr. Sodder, I used to work at Sunnyside Children's Home. I was a nurse there for almost 2 years, from 1946 to 1948. She paused, wrapping her hands around the coffee cup I'd given her. "I quit because I couldn't stand what they were doing to those children." "What do you mean? What were they doing?" "It wasn't really an orphanage, not the way most people understand orphanages. The children there weren't being prepared for adoption by loving families. They were being trained, broken down and rebuilt for specific purposes." My blood went cold. "What kind of purposes?" "Labor mostly. Farm work, factory work, domestic service. But some of the children, the smarter ones or the ones with specific skills, they were sent to what the directors called special placement programs. We weren't supposed to ask questions about where those children went." Carol reached into her purse and pulled out a small notebook, the kind nurses use for patient records. "I kept notes about some of the children because what was happening to them wasn't right. When I saw your story in the newspaper about the missing Sodder children, I recognized some of the names." She opened the notebook and showed me pages of careful handwriting. Martha Sodder, arrived January 15, 1946. Admitted under the name Martha Jones, listed as an orphan from a house fire. Initially uncooperative, refused to respond to the new name. Placed in isolation for 2 weeks until she accepted her new identity. I stared at those words until they blurred. Isolation? What kind of isolation? Solitary confinement in the basement rooms. No contact with other children, minimal food, no books or activities. They'd tell them their real families were dead and that they'd been abandoned because they were bad children. Most kids broke within a few days and started answering to whatever name they were given. She turned the page. Betty Sodder, arrived the same day, listed as Betty Williams. Younger children adapted faster to the new identities, but Betty kept asking for her mama. They used her attachment to the other Sodder children as leverage, told her that if she didn't behave, her siblings would be punished. The room felt like it was spinning. These people had systematically destroyed my children's sense of who they were, erasing their memories of our family and replacing them with false histories designed to make them compliant. "Where are they now? Do you know where they sent them?" Carol's expression became even more troubled. "That's why I came to find you, Mr. Sodder. Something happened to those children that wasn't part of the normal placement process. In the summer of 1947, there was a visit from federal officials, men in suits who came with government vehicles and official paperwork." She showed me another entry in her notebook. July 23, 1947. 5 children removed from general population on direct federal order. Martha, Betty, Louis, Jenny, and Maurice, all the Sodder children. They were loaded into government vehicles and taken away. Director Whitman told the staff they were being transferred to a specialized federal facility for their own protection. What kind of federal facility? Nobody would tell us. But I overheard one of the federal agents talking to Director Whitman. He said something about the children being too high profile and needing to be moved to a location where they could be properly secured. The agent mentioned that their father was causing problems and attracting too much attention. I felt sick. My efforts to find my children had made them more valuable as prisoners. By publicly searching for them, I'd forced whoever was holding them to move them to an even more secure location. Carol continued reading from her notebook. The federal agents left detailed instructions about what to tell anyone who asked about the Sodder children. We were supposed to say they'd been adopted by families in Canada and that all records were sealed for privacy reasons. "But you remember them. You saw them with your own eyes. I'll never forget those children, Mr. Sodder. Martha was one of the bravest kids I ever met. Even after weeks of isolation and psychological pressure, she never stopped telling the other children stories about her real family. She described you and Mrs. Sodder in such detail that some of the other kids started believing they had real families out there too. Tears were streaming down Carol's face now. That's why they moved her first. She was becoming a problem, giving the other children hope that someone might come looking for them. The night before the federal agents took her away, she asked me to promise that if I ever met her real father, I'd tell him she never stopped believing he would find her. I had to leave the room for a few minutes to compose myself. When I came back, Carol was looking through the rest of her notebook. There's something else, Mr. Sodder. Something that might help you understand the scope of what you're dealing with. She showed me a list of names and dates. In the 2 years I worked at Sunnyside, 47 children were transferred to federal facilities. All of them were from families that had experienced unusual tragedies, house fires, car accidents, disappearances. And all of those families had one thing in common. What was that? They were all immigrants or first-generation Americans who had expressed anti-fascist political views during the war. Italian families like yours, German families who had opposed Hitler, Eastern European families who had spoken out against communist regimes. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't random. Our children hadn't been taken by ordinary criminals or even a typical trafficking ring. They'd been targeted by some kind of government operation designed to silence political dissidents by taking what mattered most to them. Carol, why are you telling me this? Why risk coming here? Because I quit that job when I realized what I was really part of. I moved to California, got married, tried to forget what I'd seen. But last month, my husband and I had our first child, and I keep thinking about all those families who never got to see their children grow up. She closed the notebook and looked directly at me. Those federal agents left one piece of information that might help you. They mentioned the children were being transferred to a facility in New Mexico, something called the Pine Ridge Educational Center. She stood up to leave, then turned back to me. Mr. Sodder, I don't know if your children are still alive, but if they are, they're probably not the same children you remember. What they've been through, it changes people, especially children. You need to be prepared for that. After she left, I sat in that kitchen for hours, staring at the notes I'd taken during our conversation. Pine Ridge Educational Center, New Mexico. It was the first real lead I'd had in over 2 years. But when I called information to ask for a phone number or address for Pine Ridge Educational Center, the operator told me no such facility existed. I spent 3 weeks researching every educational facility, government installation, and federal property in New Mexico. Nothing called Pine Ridge Educational Center appeared in any official directory, but I'd learned not to trust official records. These people were experts at hiding things in plain sight. I decided to drive to New Mexico myself. If such a place existed, someone in the area would know about it, even if it operated under a different name. Jenny wanted to come, but I was afraid of what we might walk into. The people who had taken our children had already made one investigator disappear, and I couldn't risk losing Jenny too. The drive took 3 days, and I stopped in every small town between West Virginia and New Mexico, showing photographs of my children and asking about federal facilities that housed children. Most people looked at me like I was crazy, but in a diner outside Amarillo, Texas, an old trucker named Bill Hendricks studied those pictures for a long time. Mister, I've driven through New Mexico plenty of times, and there's a place outside Las Cruces that's always bothered me. Big compound with high fences and guard towers, but no signs identifying what it is. Locals call it the Pine Ridge Place, though I never knew why. He drew me a rough map on a napkin. It's about 40 miles northeast of Las Cruces, on a dirt road that branches off Highway 70. But I gotta warn you, that place has serious security. Military-style checkpoints, armed guards, the whole works. Whatever they're doing in there, they don't want visitors. I found the facility exactly where Bill had described it. From the main road, all you could see was a high fence topped with razor wire and guard towers spaced every few hundred yards. But there was a hill about a mile away that gave me a better view of the compound through binoculars I'd bought in Las Cruces. What I saw made my stomach turn. It looked like a prison camp. Multiple long, low buildings that resembled military barracks, surrounded by exercise yards with more fencing. But what really caught my attention were the children, dozens of them, all dressed in identical gray uniforms, moving in formation from one building to another under the supervision of adult guards. I spent 2 days watching that place, noting the schedules and patterns. The children appeared to be divided into age groups, with different activities for each group. Some worked in what looked like agricultural areas, others attended classes in classroom buildings, and the older ones seemed to be involved in some kind of industrial training. But I never saw any of them playing. Never saw them talking to each other casually or acting like normal children. They moved like soldiers, following orders and maintaining formation at all times. On the third day, I worked up the courage to approach the main gate. The guard who came out was polite but firm, no visitors allowed without prior authorization from federal authorities in Washington, D.C. When I explained that I was looking for my children, he claimed he'd never heard of any Sodder children and suggested I contact the appropriate government agencies through proper channels. Sir, this is a federal educational facility for special needs children. All residents are here by court order or federal placement, and their identities are protected by privacy laws. I can't provide information about specific individuals. I just want to know if my children are alive. I haven't seen them in over 3 years. The guard's expression softened slightly. I understand your concern, but I'm not authorized to discuss residents with family members. You'll need to work through official channels. That night in a motel in Las Cruces, I called every federal agency I could think of: Department of Health, Education and Welfare, Department of Justice, even the FBI. Each one transferred me to someone else, who transferred me to someone else, until I was back where I started with no answers. But the next morning, something happened that changed everything. I was having breakfast in the motel restaurant when a woman approached my table. She was maybe 35, well-dressed, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was taking a big risk by talking to me. "Are you George Sodder? I heard you asking questions at the Pine Ridge facility yesterday." "Yes, ma'am. I'm looking for my children." She sat down across from me and spoke quietly. "My name is Dr. Sarah Mitchell. I worked at Pine Ridge for 6 months as a psychologist before I quit. What they're doing to those children, it's not education, it's indoctrination." "What do you mean?" "The children are being trained to forget their original identities and accept new ones. It's a systematic program of psychological conditioning designed to create compliant workers for government and private industry. The younger children are easier to reprogram, but the older ones who remember their families require more intensive treatment." My hands started shaking. "Treatment? What kind of treatment?" "Isolation, sensory deprivation, psychological manipulation, sometimes drugs to make them more compliant. The goal is to break down their sense of self and rebuild it according to specifications provided by whoever is paying for their services." "Who's paying for this? Who's running this operation?" Dr. Mitchell looked around the restaurant nervously. "It's a joint program involving multiple agencies, but the funding comes primarily from defense contractors and large corporations that need trained workers for sensitive projects. The children graduate from Pine Ridge with new identities, work histories, and psychological profiles designed to make them ideal employees for specific jobs." She reached into her purse and pulled out a small photograph. "I smuggled this out when I left. It might interest you." The photograph showed a group of children in gray uniforms standing in formation outside one of the barracks buildings. In the back row, clearly visible despite being 3 years older, was Martha. She was staring straight ahead with an expression I'd never seen on her face before, empty, controlled, like all the life had been drained out of her. "That's my daughter," I whispered. "I remember her. Martha Jones, according to her file. One of the more difficult cases because she retained strong memories of her original family. They had to use more intensive conditioning on her than most of the other children." "Is she still there? Can I get her out?" Dr. Mitchell's expression became even more troubled. "Mr. Sodder, 3 days before I quit, Martha and 4 other children from her original group were transferred to what they called advanced placement. I was told they were being moved to permanent work assignments with their new identities. Where did they send her? I don't know the specific locations, but I overheard the administrators talking about placements in defense facilities and aerospace companies. Children with Martha's intelligence level were being prepared for technical work that required security clearances. The room felt like it was collapsing around me. My daughter had been turned into a government asset, her mind wiped and reprogrammed to serve the same system that had destroyed our family. Dr. Mitchell, how many children go through this program? During my 6 months there, I saw maybe 200 children. But Pine Ridge is just one facility. There are others like it around the country, all operating under different names and cover stories. She stood up to leave, then turned back to me. Mr. Sodder, you need to understand something. The people running this program have unlimited resources and government protection. Even if you found your children, they wouldn't remember you as their father. In their minds, George Sodder is either dead or the man who abandoned them. That's what they've been taught to believe. After she left, I sat in that restaurant for hours, staring at the photograph of Martha and trying to process what I'd learned. My children were alive, but they'd been psychologically destroyed and rebuilt as someone else's tools. The Martha in that photograph wasn't my daughter anymore. She was a product manufactured by the same people who had burned down our house and destroyed our family. But I wasn't giving up. If my children were out there working in defense facilities with new identities, there had to be some way to track them down. It would take years, maybe decades, but I would find them. I just wasn't prepared for what I would discover when I finally did. I spent the next 15 years following leads that took me across the entire country. Every time I thought I'd found one of my children, the trail would go cold or I'd discover it was someone else entirely. But I never stopped looking, and slowly, painfully, I began to piece together the network that had stolen my family. Defense contractors like Lockheed, Boeing, and Raytheon all employed workers with backgrounds that didn't quite add up when you looked closely. People who had started working in the early 1950s with perfect employment records but no verifiable history before that. No childhood friends, no school records that anyone could remember, no family connections that made sense. In 1963, I finally got a breakthrough. A sympathetic clerk at a Lockheed facility in California noticed that I'd been making inquiries about employees with certain physical characteristics and birth dates. She contacted me privately and told me about a woman who worked in their technical documentation department. Her name is Mary Henderson, and she's been here since 1951. Excellent employee, very reliable, but she never talks about her past. Says her family died in a fire when she was young and she was raised in foster care. But here's the thing that might interest you. She has a small scar above her left eyebrow, and when she concentrates really hard on her work, she hums this little tune that sounds foreign, maybe Italian. My heart nearly stopped. Martha had hummed that same Italian lullaby when she was doing her homework, and she'd gotten that scar falling off her bicycle when she was 10. I drove to California and spent 3 days watching the Lockheed facility, waiting for a chance to see this Mary Henderson. When she finally emerged from the building after her shift, I knew immediately it was Martha. She was 28 years old now, a grown woman, but she had the same dark eyes and the same way of walking that I remembered. I followed her to a small apartment complex about 10 miles from the plant. She lived alone, drove a modest car, and seemed to have no close relationships with anyone. Her life appeared to be entirely centered around her work, home to the office, office to home, with occasional stops at the grocery store or library. It took me 2 weeks to work up the courage to approach her. I waited until she was coming out of the library on a Saturday afternoon, carrying a stack of technical manuals that suggested she was still studying even in her free time. "Excuse me, miss. Are you Mary Henderson?" She looked at me with polite caution. "Yes, can I help you? My name is George Sodder. I think you might be my daughter." The change in her expression was immediate and alarming. Her face went completely blank, like someone had flipped a switch, and she took several steps backward. "I'm sorry, sir, but you're mistaken. My father died when I was very young. I think you have me confused with someone else." "Martha, it's me. It's your daddy. I've been looking for you for 17 years. That's when something terrifying happened. She started breathing rapidly, almost hyperventilating, and her hands began shaking uncontrollably. My name is Mary Henderson. My father is dead. My family died in a fire and I was raised by foster parents. You're confusing me with someone else. She was repeating these statements like they were lines she'd memorized, but her body language suggested she was fighting some kind of internal battle. Sweat was beading on her forehead, and she kept glancing around like she was looking for an escape route. Martha, I know this is confusing, but I can prove who you are. You used to have a doll named Caroline that I made for your 8th birthday. You loved to sing the Italian song that my mother taught me. You got that scar above your eye when you fell off your bicycle trying to ride without holding the handlebars. For just a moment, something flickered in her eyes, recognition, maybe, or confusion. But then she pressed her hands to her temples and started backing away from me faster. Stop it. Stop saying these things. You're trying to confuse me. I know who I am. I know my history. My family is dead. Martha, please. I'm your father. Your real father. We lived in West Virginia, and we had a house fire, but you didn't die. Someone took you and your brothers and sisters. I've been searching for you ever since. That's when she started screaming. Not words, just a high-pitched wail of distress that brought people running from all directions. A security guard from the library came outside, and Martha ran to him like I was attacking her. This man is harassing me, she said, her voice shaking. He's saying things that aren't true, trying to make me believe things that never happened. The security guard looked me over suspiciously. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to leave this lady alone. She's my daughter. Her real name is Martha Sodder, and she was kidnapped from our house when she was 12 years old. Mister, this lady's name is Mary Henderson, and she's a respected member of this community. If you don't leave her alone, I'm calling the police. I tried to give Martha my contact information, tried to tell her where she could find me if she wanted to learn the truth, but the security guard wouldn't let me get close to her. As I was walking away, I heard her talking to him in a voice that sounded like a frightened child. He knew things about me that nobody should know. How did he know about the scar? How did he know about the song? That night, I sat in my hotel room and tried to understand what I'd just witnessed. This wasn't just a case of someone who'd been given a new identity and told to forget their past. This was systematic psychological conditioning that had created genuine false memories while suppressing real ones. But the conditioning wasn't perfect. Somewhere deep inside, Martha still remembered fragments of her real childhood. I decided to try a different approach. Instead of confronting her directly, I would try to gradually reawaken her suppressed memories by leaving carefully chosen reminders in places where she might find them. I left a photograph of our family tucked under her car windshield wiper. I mailed her copies of her school assignments that I'd saved from before the fire. I even sent her a recording of me singing that Italian lullaby, hoping it might trigger something. But each attempt seemed to make things worse. She started looking over her shoulder constantly, like she was being watched. She changed her route to and from work. She even moved to a different apartment complex across town. Then, 3 weeks after our first encounter, I received a phone call that shattered everything I thought I understood about my daughter's situation. Mr. Sodder, this is Dr. William Patterson from Camarillo State Hospital. We have a patient here who was admitted yesterday after a severe psychological breakdown. She keeps asking for someone named George Sodder. I drove to Camarillo State Hospital that same day, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. Dr. Patterson met me in the lobby, a tired-looking man in his 50s who seemed genuinely concerned about his patient. Mr. Sodder, I have to warn you that Mary Henderson is in a very fragile psychological state. She's been alternating between periods of catatonic silence and episodes where she becomes extremely agitated, claiming that people are trying to steal her memories. He led me through sterile corridors that smelled of disinfectant and despair. She was brought in by her supervisor at Lockheed after she suffered what appears to be a complete psychological breakdown at work. Started screaming that her life was a lie, that someone had stolen her real memories and replaced them with false ones. We stopped outside a door with a small window. Through the glass, I could see Martha sitting on a narrow bed, staring at the wall with an expression I'd never seen before, like she was trying to solve an impossible puzzle inside her own mind. She keeps repeating certain phrases, Dr. Patterson continued. Things like, Daddy made me a doll named Caroline, and, we had a Christmas tree with red ornaments. But then she'll suddenly stop and say, that's not real, that's not my life, my family is dead. When I entered the room, Martha looked up at me with eyes that seemed to flicker between recognition and confusion. For a moment she smiled, the same bright smile I remembered from when she was 12. Then her expression changed, becoming fearful and uncertain. You're the man from the library. You're trying to confuse me. Martha, I'm your father. I know this is hard to understand, but the memories you have of your family dying in a fire, those aren't real. Someone put those memories in your head to make you forget us. She pressed her hands to her temples, wincing like she was in physical pain. Stop saying that name. My name is Mary Henderson. I know who I am. But even as she said it, tears were streaming down her face. Why do I remember things that never happened? Why do I know that song you hummed when you followed me? Why do I dream about a house with a big kitchen and brothers and sisters I never had? I sat down in the chair next to her bed, moving slowly so I wouldn't frighten her. Because those dreams are real memories, sweetheart. That was our house. Those were your brothers and sisters. Your mama's name is Jenny, and she's been waiting for you to come home for 18 years. For the next 3 hours, I told her everything I could remember about her childhood. How she used to help Jenny bake bread on Sundays. How she'd practiced piano every evening after dinner. How she'd cried when our old dog Rex died, and how we'd buried him under the apple tree in our backyard. With each memory I shared, she became more agitated, but also more alive somehow. Like pieces of herself were fighting to surface through whatever had been done to her mind. They told us our families didn't want us anymore, she whispered. They said we were bad children, and that's why we had to learn to be different people. Who told you that? Who did this to you? The doctors at the place with the gray buildings. They said if we remembered the wrong things, we would get sick and have to stay in the dark rooms. So we learned to remember only what they wanted us to remember. She described the Pine Ridge facility in detail, the isolation chambers, the psychological conditioning sessions, the drugs they gave children who resisted the programming. But she also told me something that made my blood run cold. There were other children from our family there. Louis and little Jenny and Betty. But they took Louis away when he wouldn't stop asking for you. They said he was defective and had to go to a special place for children who couldn't be fixed. Where did they take him? Do you know what happened to your brother? Martha's face went blank for a moment, like she was trying to access a memory that had been locked away. They told us he had an accident. That he fell downstairs and hurt his head. But Betty whispered to me that she saw them put Louis in a van with men in white coats. She said he was crying and calling for Mama. The room felt like it was spinning. My son hadn't been placed in a work program like Martha. He'd been eliminated because he couldn't be psychologically broken. What about the girls? What happened to Betty and little Jenny? They were younger, so the programming worked better on them. Last time I saw them, they didn't remember our real names anymore. They thought their names were Susan and Carol, and they believed their parents had abandoned them because they were orphans nobody wanted. Martha suddenly grabbed my hand with desperate strength. Daddy, I can feel them trying to come back, the real memories. But it hurts so much. Like there's something in my head fighting against remembering. What did they do to me? Dr. Patterson, who had been quietly observing our conversation, spoke up. Mr. Sodder, what your daughter is describing sounds like systematic psychological conditioning combined with possible pharmaceutical intervention. If what she's saying is true, her original memories weren't just suppressed, they were actively replaced with false ones through a combination of trauma, suggestion, and chemical enhancement. Over the following weeks, I visited Martha every day. Slowly, painfully, fragments of her real childhood began to surface. She remembered the smell of Jenny's cooking, the sound of Maurice practicing his harmonica, the way the house creaked on windy nights. But each recovered memory seemed to cause her physical pain, like her mind was punishing her for remembering the wrong things. Then, on December 24, 1965, exactly 20 years after the fire, Martha looked at me with completely clear eyes for the first time since I'd found her. Daddy, I remember everything now. The fire, the men who took us, the place where they changed us into different people. But I also remember something else they made us promise never to tell. What was that, sweetheart? There are more places like Pine Ridge. Hundreds of them. And thousands of children who've been turned into people they were never supposed to be. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They're still doing it, Daddy. Right now, somewhere, they're taking another family's children and erasing who they really are. 3 days after that conversation, I arrived at the hospital to find Martha's room empty. Dr. Patterson told me she'd been transferred during the night to a specialized federal facility for her own protection. No forwarding address, no contact information, no way for me to find her again. The nurse who'd been caring for Martha slipped me a note as I was leaving. She wanted you to know that she remembers who she really is now, and she'll never forget again. But she also said to tell you that some fights can't be won, only witnessed. I never saw Martha again. 2 weeks later, I received an official death certificate stating that Mary Henderson had died by suicide at a federal medical facility. But I knew better. They'd killed her rather than risk her talking about what she'd remembered. I'm 83 years old now, and I've spent 44 years searching for my children. I found traces of some of them, work records, rental agreements, medical files, but never the children themselves. The system that took them was too big, too well protected, too ruthless to allow families like mine to reclaim what had been stolen. But last week, something happened that gives me hope that the truth might eventually surface. A package arrived with no return address, containing 5 small metal boxes. Inside each box was a child's tooth and a lock of hair, along with a note written in different handwriting. We remember who we were. We remember who our father is. The truth will not die with us. I don't know which of my children are still alive, or what names they're living under now. But somewhere out there, pieces of the Sodder family survive, carrying memories that powerful people tried to erase. That fire on Christmas Eve, 1945, didn't just destroy our house. It was the beginning of something much larger and more sinister than I ever imagined. And maybe, someday, the full truth about what happened to families like mine will finally come to light. But until then, I keep those 5 small boxes on my kitchen table and I remember.